Welcome to The Strategic Leader, the podcast for people-focused leaders who want to think, act and feel more strategic. I'm Gemma Bullivant.
And I'm Fee Craig. In this series, we're tackling the big, hairy questions shaping the world of work and exploring how to respond with strategic clarity, not just strong opinions.
Hi, and welcome back to The Strategic Leader with me, Gemma Bullivant.
And with me, Fee Craig. And in this series, we're exploring the big, messy questions that are shaping the future of work and leadership. Gem, today's question is a hot topic, I know, for you in your line of work specifically. How transparent should we be about pay? Sounds like an easy question, but I know it's very much in your wheelhouse, so you're going to be the expert today. So tell us a bit more about this. How transparent should we be about pay?
Yeah, thanks, Fee. Yes, it's a great question. It's something that's been at the heart of a lot of the work I've done for many years, actually, but it's gathered a lot of momentum recently, and it is definitely becoming a hot topic of conversation. So today we thought it would be good to explore this. Why now? Why is this shift happening now? We're going to be looking at why lots of organisations maybe aren't as transparent as either they'd like to be or that employees would like them to be. There are risks. So there's some risks of going too far, not having the right structures in place. And I'm going to share a bit of a practical roadmap, a practical set of actions that you can take to really think about how ready you are for pay transparency, how much you need or want, and some practical tips that sit around that, because we love some practical tips, don't we?
We do. We very much like some practical tips. So let's go back to the beginning then. Why are things accelerating at the moment? What is driving this positive shift towards it? Other than it sounds like a great idea, but why now?
There's a couple of things going on. We have in Europe, we've got the EU Pay Transparency Directive, and there have been similar things going on in the US and in other countries across the world. But today we're really going to focus on the EU Pay Transparency Directive. I'll explain a little bit more about what that is. But it is a really, really significant piece of legislation that's coming in that is going to shift the needle along the transparency continuum, if you put it that way. And even though in the UK, where we are, we're not covered by that directive, we are naturally going to see a bit of a groundswell, a bit of a shift in expectations from employees, which is the second point, really. Employee expectations have evolved. People increasingly want more clarity, more fairness, more transparency. They want to know how pay decisions have been taken. We know from loads of research that people are more likely to respond to job adverts if they've got the salary in the job advert than not. And that there's an enormous amount of frustration when so many adverts still go out there with no salary, or the line that triggers lots and lots of people around competitive salary.
Yes.
See lots of posts on socials about that, and, rightly so. But as we'll talk about a bit more as we go through, it isn't actually just employers being a bit awkward or a bit sly or a bit shifty. Often they just aren't in a position to be able to do that in a way that isn't going to trigger some other knock-on effects. So we're going to talk about that a little bit.
So I guess what I've just heard then is that there is new legislation coming and all organisations are going to have to comply with that. Is that regardless of the size of the organisation? Is there any kind of cut-off point, or is it going to apply
Yeah.
within the EU or people who employ staff within the EU?
Yeah, great question. It is of any company, regardless of where they are based. So it could be a company that's based outside of the EU.
Mm.
If they have workers in an EU country, even if it's one worker,
Okay.
they will be obliged to follow the directive as it's described in that particular country, which is a whole other nuance. Because just to put it really simply, the EU have stated its minimum obligations for EU companies to comply with. Then each individual EU member state is going off and creating their own legislation. So they have to as a bare minimum, go with what the EU is saying, but they might make it even more challenging than the AU minimum requirement. So
Mhm.
what we're likely to see, and it's still evolving, countries are still putting this in place. The date for this to be in place in all of the EU member states is June 2026. So governments are still creating their legislation to go through their processes as we speak. And so, at the time that we're recording this in August 2025,
Mm.
we still haven't got visibility of what each individual country is going to say, but we do know the bare minimum of EU requirements.
So, okay, so there's a compliance angle. You're basically just going to have to comply with these, and we know what the EU ones are, and they may be more stringent depending on where you have employees. Beyond that,
Yeah.
but it's not just compliance, is it? It's a cultural thing. So, as you're saying, that employees are the workforce is just demanding more clarity on this. Is that
It
right?
is, it is. I often talk about this in relation to trust because when if we think about anything really, when there's transparency, when there is a sense of openness and honesty, even if we don't necessarily like the message, if any information is withheld, if there aren't answers to a particular point or question, we start to suspect something. The trust starts to erode. We might even start filling the blanks with our own version that is not not the
Mm,
case
yeah.
anywhere, people making stuff up. So transparency as a principle and as a cultural principle has been on the reward agenda for many, many years.
Mm.
And as I said before, it is now being pushed along by legislation, but it's always been something that has been an important point to discuss. How transparent do you want to be about pay in your organisation? There's now going to be less, I guess, discretion to answer that question for companies than perhaps previously, where you could have had the right to say, don't want any transparency. I want to be completely opaque. I will take the hit on trust
Mhm.
if telling me that culturally that's a risk. And you go, okay, well that's your prerogative. That's going to actually now start to be questioned and challenged, and there's these requirements are going to need to be adhered to.
So the big question, or the big sort of idea that comes to mind when I think about pay transparency is the gender pay divide, which is not the same thing, but it's related. So gender is part of the driver behind the pay transparency. Are there other things?
Yeah. So in actual fact, it's the overarching exam question that I think the EU are attempting to answer with this legislation is to address the gender pay gap. The gender pay gap reporting as we know it, both in the UK and EU and elsewhere where it exists, is there to report on some headline differences in pay between men and women in organisations. But it is still very headline in nature. You don't get a true sense of like for like comparisons in gender pay gap reporting. I won't go into the nuts and bolts of that. Effectively, it's quite a high level, and it is broadly that any pay gap number that you see is significantly influenced by the number of men you've got in your leadership team versus women.
Yeah.
Because the way that the pay gap number is reported and calculated is based on seniority levels, and that's broad and then it's aggregated.
Mhm.
Now, what this legislation is doing is it's saying, okay, we've done our best to address that, and some countries have done better than others, but we need to go another layer down, and we need to keep initiating more and more ways in which we can legislate for this to be truly addressed and adhered to by companies. There's four key areas that the legislation tackles. So I think I'll just quickly summarize those, and maybe we can talk about each one and what your take is on them. The first area is all around recruitment. And this is about recruitment transparency. So this is going back to one of those emotive points that I mentioned earlier, putting a salary in a job ad. It's not explicitly stated that the salary has to go in the job ad, but the practicality is that it will, because what the legislation says is you have to declare the salary for the job before you start talking about the candidate's expectations or the
Mm.
candidate's current salary history.
So even though it doesn't have to be in the job ad, they need to have that piece of information before they kind of start really engaging in the process. So it's
Yeah,
effectively, it's going to have to come up
yeah,
in one way or
yeah,
another. Okay.
exactly. So the likelihood is that we will start seeing job adverts with salaries in them.
That feels big though. So by June of next year, June 26,
Yeah.
every job ad. So we basically we won't see, salary based on experience or competitive salary or, apply further for. Okay, so that's one area.
Yeah,
What else have we got?
yeah. Now, the other one that's related to that, just quickly, is this point about not asking for salary history. So if you think about it,
Yeah.
if you've got 2 candidates for a job and you're thinking about making a job offer, you've got a man and a woman, and they're both in the mix for this job offer. If you are basing your job offer and the salary for that job offer on what is an increase on what their current salary might be, or their salary expectations, because of the inherent fact that women are typically paid less than men, you are just perpetuating
Mm.
the gender pay gap as it carries on. So one of the strong arguments for meaning that you cannot ask for salary history at the point of recruitment is to take that back to first principles of, we know what the job involves, we know what the market should pay for this, and we therefore are going to offer what we think is right for it, regardless of what you are on right now.
Okay, so they are not allowed to ask you what your current salary is or what you have earned?
Not without having already revealed what the salary range is
Okay.
for the role.
In terms of I'll show you, you show me yours, I'll show you mine kind of thing. They have to state their range or their expectation or their target, whatever it might be, before you reveal what you're currently on. Okay, so
Yeah,
that feels major, doesn't it? That feels like a
yeah, yeah,
in
yeah,
some I mean, obviously some companies are already doing that, but that feels like a major step forward some
yeah.
for some organizations. That feels like a very good thing for the employee.
Yeah, exactly. And as we've said, it is EU. So this is what's happening in the EU. It is not a requirement in the UK, but it is likely that there's going to be a real shift, and we're going to see a lot more of that happening in the UK.
Yes.
And companies are going to start being a little bit behind the ball as compared to other companies who have either chosen to do this, regardless of requirements, or because they happen to have a footprint in an EU country, they're having to do this anyway. So why not do it in the UK, just the same as they're having to do in their other countries? So I think there's just going to be a market shift generally in this area.
So that's recruitment. What are the other you mentioned 4 points, so that's one. What else?
Yeah. So the next one is about pay structures and pay progression. So, put simply, organizations are going to need to document and communicate clear and objective criteria, gender neutral, as is the case in all of this, but clear and objective criteria for how they set pay, how they award pay increases, pay rises, how they connected to that promotion eligibility, and how you move through an organization. So they're gonna need to actually be in a position to define the criteria. So it's no longer going to be a case that you can say it was a discretionary decision on the part of a bunch of managers sitting in a room in front of a spreadsheet. You're going to actually need to have some clear criteria that you can, and principles that you can share with employees in a way that they understand. So that's another part of the
Mhm,
legislation. It can't bamboozle people with complicated HR speak,
mhm.
and it just needs to be consistently applied and therefore consistently shared with in the right way.
So it strikes me that many companies, I guess many smaller companies, maybe not your big corporates, many smaller companies won't have that. They won't have a clear idea of how
No,
that work, so it's
no,
not just a question of, okay, now you need to make that public. Now that you need to share that with candidates. It's a question of now you need to go and have one. You need to put a structure in place. You need to set a policy for how this happens. You need to set those objectives for progression. That feels quite a big step forward for some companies, I would really think.
Yes, absolutely. And this is where a lot of the work that I've been doing over the years in relation to reward architecture, job architecture, sizing roles, creating a framework. So even if you have a very simple framework, which is generally plenty for most small and scale up companies, is having 5 levels, your basic delivery roles, your professional specialists, your first line managers, your leaders, your exec, something like that. But a framework where you can plot your roles and you can say, okay, so these are broadly the criteria that we apply for each of those levels. And then when somebody is sitting in one of those levels, you can then say, well, you can't go to level 3 until you've demonstrated the ability to do this, 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 and this. Not to say you need a full competency matrix or anything like that, but you do need to have a way that you can describe in a fair and consistent and objective way that this is how we progress pay in the organization. This is the framework we use to help to structure those decisions, and this is therefore the reason behind your 6% increase this year, for example.
So this is already getting super interesting because, I came into this thinking, well, pay transparency can only be a good thing. I don't know why you wouldn't be transparent about what you're paying for roles, but already I can see that there is more to this than just simply publishing the salary range at recruitment stage.
Yeah.
It goes kind of all the way through the organization for every single person. And I would suspect that many companies are not ready for this. Just let's finish up on the other 4 areas. We talked recruitment, we've talked about being clear about that structure and progression. What else have we got?
So there's I think about this third one, it's all about the employee's right to their pay information.
Uh-huh.
So if you think about this in the context of GDPR, the dreaded
Oh, I
GDPR,
remember when that one.
where where there became quite a shift in the burden of proof, and that employees could request information about themselves, their own data, and so on. In the context of pay, an employee now has the right to ask for the information, such as the pay structure and progression stuff that I've just talked about. And you have an obligation to provide that. And there's going to be some guidelines in each country's legislation and how they interpret it. But broadly speaking, it's how does my pay compare to the average of people who have a role that is similar to mine, either the same role as mine or broadly similar to mine in terms of equal value. Hugely complex, really, really complicated to go into on this particular call. But effectively, it's that next layer of saying, do you remember you might be familiar with some of this, the dinner ladies and bin men equal pay for equal
Oh,
value
uh-huh.
uh,
Mhm. Yeah.
thing. What they were saying, with the dinner ladies were saying, well, our job is of equal value to the bin men. So why are we not on the same pay scale as the bin men? That's super simplified
Yeah.
summary of what that particular case was about. What this legislation is saying is that companies need to get clear on how they categorize workers beyond a simple grading system and so that they can basically answer that question of, yeah, we think the dinner ladies are broadly the same as the bin men for this reason and this reason, or not, depending on
So,
which way
so I
I
guess
think.
I've been many places where you'd have like, oh, you're a you're a grade 7 or you're a band 5 or whatever it would be. But it's not
Yeah,
always clear, well, what makes this role a 7 and that role an 8
yeah.
or a 6. So now you have to be clear about that. And the employees have a right to access that information to know exactly what it is. I guess that goes back to the transparency.
Yep, they have a right to access why you think a role is a 7 and not an 8. They also have the right to access, let's say that your role is a 7, you know your own pay, they have a right to ask for the average of the role 7s in the organisation.
Okay, so they can't ask what their co-worker's salary is, or
Not individual salaries,
but
they
they
can
can
only
ask
get the average.
an average. Okay, but still that's useful, isn't it? Because you want to know,
Mm.
how am I stacking up against my peers?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
And of course, we'll get onto this in a minute in risks, but a lot of organisations don't even run that analysis themselves,
Mm.
never mind be in a position to be able to present that number in a timely way. So there's a lot of work to be done in getting the architecture right, in order to fulfil that obligation. The fourth area is all about reporting, but if you think of it really as an extension of the current gender pay gap reporting. So companies are still gonna need to generate gender pay gap reports. Companies that are 250 and above typically are the ones that fall into this bracket, but some countries are going below that threshold, so you just have to be really careful on local legislation. Some countries are going to, say, 100 employees in that particular geography. Where you have the obligation to do a gender pay gap report, it is going to have to go down to what's called the category of worker level.
Mhm.
This is this new layer of detail. So currently, you just have to create some comparisons by, let's call it by quartile,
Mhm.
organize all your people into the lowest, the second highest, and the highest
Mhm.
group pay. And then how do they compare? You're going to have to go down to this category of worker level to get into this equal pay for equal value lens. And that relies on having that architecture and those definitions of how, are your bin men the same as the dinner ladies or not?
Okay, so there's so much more to this than just being transparent, isn't there? Well, in order to be transparent, you have to do an awful lot of work behind the scenes. So I would imagine that many organizations are either getting this wrong already or just not making any effort in this space already, or doing something, but it's not going to be the right thing come June of next year. So what are the risks of, I mean,
Well,
it sounds all like it's a good thing, right? It sounds like it benefits the employee hugely. You can see the benefit to the employee. And to your point about that builds trust in the employer, so there's a benefit to the employer. But what are the other risks that we need to consider? What could go wrong here?
there are obviously risks about not doing this in an objective way at all. So there are risks that your architecture is flawed in some way. So there's definitely a need to be really comfortable that the criteria that you use to organize your jobs are, is robust. There's risks that you have outliers in your existing teams. So
Mm.
by that, I mean people who are paid way above or way below the average number for the rest of them. Because if you think about it, if they're asking for their pay as a comparison to their peers, even on an average level, if you've got lots of outliers, you need to know that you've got those outliers.
Yes. Yeah.
And might even come about as the minute they see a job advert that's got the salary range in it. Hang on a second, why is that role being advertised at 40 to 50 when I'm on 35?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Or why is that role being advertised at 30, 40 to 50 and I'm on 60? What does that mean?
Yeah.
And so lots of those sorts of questions are going to start to be unearthed as well. So companies need to be really prepared for this. And I call it a bit of a readiness checklist. I think
Yeah.
just to close the episode on some practical things, the way that I'm working with clients at the moment on this is to do a bit of a diagnostic on how ready you are. Thinking about each of those areas, how ready are you to put those salaries in job ads? Could you choose to do that right away and it wouldn't cause a great deal of problems? You probably need to figure out how structured your job architecture is and how comfortable you are with it before you can truly answer the first question. But ultimately, you've got to do a bit of a diagnostic on each of the four areas and work out, broadly speaking, where you are and what you need to do in order to be at least at baseline compliance by June 2026.
So
I've prepared a bit of a checklist. I've prepared some questions, some things to help understand that. So put all of that sort of stuff in the show notes.
mm,
I've mentioned a few of them now, but there's a few others just to really get a sense of where your risks truly sit. And it's something to get really clear on before you get too close to June, because if there are things that need to happen in order to start correcting some of the challenging outliers, for example, that's gonna need some budget. And
It is, isn't it? I would imagine that you're gonna come across there's a bit Russian dolls, isn't it? We can't do that bit until we've sorted out that bit, and we can't sort out that bit until we've addressed that bit. And you may have people on really random salaries because they just haven't asked for it over the years, so they've got left behind. You may have people on strangely high ones because they just happen to have negotiated really well when they joined, or they've just made an awful fuss, or because they're the person who's managing them has got their own views on what their team should be paid, which is not consistent across the whole of the business. You can see that there could be a huge drains up needed. And so next
Mm.
June doesn't seem that far away. So your practical tips sound good. So you have a readiness checklist that takes people through all of those areas. Because I think if I was an employer at the moment of a reasonable size, I've got all these different levels within the business, it would be reasonable to think that I might be having a bit of a panic at this moment.
Hmm. Absolutely, especially if you do have workers in the EU, because there will definitely need to be, you have an urgency
Yeah.
immediately if you've got workers in the EU. Arguably less of an urgency if you are solely UK based, but I do, go back to what I said earlier, that I think that the market is moving in this general direction. And if a lot of your competitors, whether that's competitors in the direct sense to your company, but more importantly, competitors of who else might hire your talent,
Yeah.
if they have an EU presence, they will be that bit more transparent than you will and are likely to be hoovering up talent a bit more successfully, especially in the recruitment market.
And talent may actually be looking for EU-based companies or companies that are, you know, declaring that they are following this. I guess even if they don't have to, I guess it is going to be part
Yeah,
you could look for if you are, because it's not just about transparency at recruitment stage, it's about transparency all the way through and showing that you have a clear structured strategy, clear shared strategy available to all for how you structure your pay throughout the whole of your organization, which
absolutely.
feels like a very good thing if you're thinking about who do I want to work for? Do I want to work with a company that has that and is publishable and challengeable? Because if it's publishable, then people can see it and can challenge it over somebody who doesn't have it or isn't prepared to share.
Yeah.
So that feels
And
like
this
a huge thing you might get left behind on.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And this goes back to what you said earlier, the point that you made around it's more than compliance. It's a cultural shift, a cultural decision, because as I said, we know that more transparency means we're better placed to build trust with employees. And if employees are going to be demanding this stuff, it's heading in that direction, even if we're not legally obliged to do that in the UK. Culturally, it's got to be something that we don't want to be left behind on out in the talent market. So I think we're going to see a groundswell regardless.
So, Jem, I feel like I've learned a huge amount today about the EU Pay Transparency Directive, which I'd heard of. It struck me as being a really good thing. It struck me as being, why on earth are we not more transparent about pay anyway? I can hear that it's a lot more complex than it sounds, but we've got time and there is expertise out there. So you talked about some resources. Where could people find these resources if they want to go and look at this for more information?
Well, I will put links to my resources in the show notes. There's also plenty of stuff on my website. I've also created a white paper, a full guide on what we've covered today in more detail. I've also created a readiness checklist just as a bit of a quick and dirty to get our heads around the basics. But the white paper guide has a lot more information. And I'm very, very happy to talk to anyone who just wants to figure out where the heck to start in
Ah,
their own organisation. Everyone's going to be in a different place with different requirements. So I'm more than happy to help with that.
Well, that sounds. I know what I'd be doing if I was an employer. I'd be straight on the phone to you. Go, come and help us. Oh, thank you so much for sharing so much of your experience on this, Gem. I'm sure it will be hugely valuable to people who are listening.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
So thank you so much to everybody for listening to this episode of The Strategic Leader, and we will be back with another one very soon. Thanks so much for listening. Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Strategic Leader. We'd love it if you could subscribe or maybe share with a colleague or just leave us a quick review.
And if you have a big, hairy question you'd like us to explore, or perhaps a strategic dilemma you're wrestling with, just drop us a line. Gemma@gemmabullivant.co.uk.
And remember, having a strategic viewpoint doesn't necessarily mean having all the answers. It's more about asking better questions, broadening your view, and staying curious.
We'll see you next time.